She is my mother. Annie's voice broke before she could finish the sentence. She hurried down the last few steps, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor. Her eyes were wet, and one hand pressed tightly against her chest, as if her heart hurt too much to bear. "Dad, please don't send my mother away," she said, reaching for Richard Whitmore's hand. Her fingers wrapped around his, trembling and fragile, just as they had when she was little and frightened by storms. "Please don't fire her. She is my mother." Richard looked down at Annie's hand gripping his. For one brief moment, the anger on his face seemed to fall away, replaced by confusion. "What did you just say?" he asked quietly. Annie swallowed hard. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Richard bent slightly toward her, his voice lower now, careful but trembling in a way he could not hide. "Annie, say that again. Tell me what you just said. Who is your mother?" Annie looked at him, then turned toward Clara Mae Johnson, the house cleaner, standing near the center of the foyer. The damp cloth was still folded neatly in her hand, as if she were only an employee who had accidentally stepped into a storm that did not belong to her. Clara's face had gone pale, her lips trembling without a word. Annie tightened her hold on Richard's hand. "It's true, Dad," she whispered. "Clara is my mother." Clara let out a small, broken sound, so painful it was almost inaudible. "Annie, don't do this." That one sentence made Richard's jaw tighten. He turned sharply toward Clara. His voice dropped, cold and hard, almost a growl. "What did you say to my daughter to make her speak like this?" Clara flinched, but she did not step back. "Mr. Whitmore, I never meant for this to happen. That is not what I asked." Richard pointed toward Annie without taking his eyes off Clara. "What have you been putting into her head?" "Nothing," Annie said quickly. "Dad, she didn't put anything into my head. Annie, let me handle this." "No, please." Annie moved closer to him, still holding his hand with both of hers. "Please don't be angry with her. She didn't ask me to say anything. She didn't even want me to know." Harold Pike cleared his throat softly. It was the familiar sound of a man pretending he was reluctant to interfere, when in truth he had been waiting for the perfect moment to speak. He stepped closer to Richard, folding his arms across his coat with a solemn expression that felt almost cold. "Sir," Harold said, "you know I would never speak disrespectfully. I have always appreciated your kindness. You gave Mrs. Johnson an opportunity when many others might not have done so, and I have tried, truly tried, to guide her because you asked me to." He glanced toward Clara, but recently, her work has become careless. I would even say lazy. She has been slow, leaving tasks unfinished, and lingering near Miss Annie's room when there was no clear reason for her to be there. And now, somehow, Miss Annie is standing here defending her and calling her mother. Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. Harold looked at her with a trace of pity that held no real kindness. "I cannot know what she may have said in private, sir, but it must have been something serious to make Miss Annie believe such a thing." Annie turned to Harold. Her face was not angry as much as wounded. "Mr. Pike, please don't say that. She hasn't done anything wrong. I only want what is best for you, Miss Annie." "No," Annie said softly. "You want Dad to think badly of her." Richard's hand stiffened in hers. "Annie." She immediately looked back at him, her voice gentler now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I just can't stand here and let you send her away." Harold bowed his head slightly toward Richard. "Sir, forgive me for speaking plainly, but I fear this is no longer just inappropriate behavior. This woman may have had intentions from the beginning. Theft, blackmail, some plan to pressure your family. Otherwise, why would she approach Miss Annie and plant such an idea in her mind?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "That is not true." Harold did not look at her. He only looked at Richard. "If I may be honest, sir, keeping her in this house after what has just happened would be unwise. You have been generous, but generosity can sometimes be mistaken for weakness by people like her." Richard's face turned stern again. For 12 years, Annie had been the center of his life. He had given her his name, his protection, his home, every opportunity he could offer, and every rare hour he could spare. And now, in the middle of his own foyer, a woman in a gray uniform stood before him while Annie wept and begged him not to send her away. Richard looked at Clara. His voice was low with anger. "I have overlooked your clumsiness more than once because Harold advised me to be patient. I gave you chances to correct your mistakes. I accepted your slowness. I tolerated your confusion because I believed everyone deserved an honest chance to work in this house. Clara lowered her head. Yes, sir. But what is this? Richard's voice rose. You linger around my daughter. You get close to her room. You wait for private moments. And somehow she ends up standing here calling you mother. Did you think I would accept that? Annie shook her head as her sobs broke through. Dad, please. She wasn't lingering around me. She helped me. Richard looked at her. There was pain in his eyes, but the firmness had not left him. Annie, you are emotional right now. You don't understand what people are capable of when they want access to a family like ours. I do understand, she whispered. I understand more than you think. Richard turned to Clara. Pack your belongings and leave this house immediately. Clara's shoulders pulled in, but she did not argue. She only looked at Annie. That look carried so much sorrow that Annie let out a small broken sound, like a plea torn straight from her chest. No, Dad. Annie stepped in front of Clara, not with pride, but with the trembling fear of a child trying to hold on to someone who might be taken from her life once again. Please, don't make her leave. Not like this. Move aside. I can't. Richard's voice sharpened. Annie, I said, move aside. She shook her head. Tears fell without stopping. Please don't make me do that. Please, Dad. Just 1 minute. Listen to me for 1 minute. Harold immediately stepped in when he noticed Richard's brief hesitation. Sir, this is exactly why she must leave now. The longer she stays, the more emotional Miss Annie will become. Mrs. Johnson has crossed a boundary no employee should ever cross. If you allow her to remain, she will only tighten her influence over Miss Annie. Clara's voice escaped almost as a breath. I have never controlled her. Richard turned on her sharply. I did not give you permission to speak. Clara fell silent. Annie's face tightened with pain. Dad, don't speak to her like that. Richard looked at Annie. The pain in his eyes made him look older in that moment. I am trying to protect you, but you are hurting her. I am protecting my daughter from a woman who has never given me one honest answer. She was afraid, Annie said. She was afraid you would throw her out before you ever listened to the truth. Harold shook his head. Miss Annie, please calm down. This is exactly how manipulation works. She makes herself look weak so you feel responsible for her. Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to end this now. Have security escort her out, change every access code in the house, and let your attorneys review every contact she has had with Miss Annie. Richard drew in a deep breath, fighting to hold on to the last of his composure. Harold is right. This has gone too far. No, Annie reached for Richard's hand again, but this time he did not close his fingers around hers. That small refusal hurt her more than his anger. Dad, please, you always taught me to tell the truth, even when my voice was shaking. My voice is shaking now, but I am still telling you the truth. Richard did not answer. Annie lifted her left hand. In it was a small bamboo pinwheel, old and worn. One blade was cracked, and the handle had been smoothed by years of being kept, touched, and hidden away. She made this for me when I was little. Richard looked at the pinwheel, then back at Annie. You told me you didn't remember where it came from. I didn't know how to remember, Annie said. Not until I heard her sing. Clara covered her mouth with one hand. Annie continued, her voice choked but clearer with every word. When I was tired, she brought me honey tea, the same tea I used to drink when I was scared. When it rained, she knew to leave the hallway light on. She called me my little Annie when she thought I was asleep, and she has that scar. Richard's eyes narrowed. What scar? Annie gently took Clara's wrist and turned it over. Clara let her, though her whole body seemed to shrink beneath everyone's gaze. Across the inside of her wrist was a long, pale scar. Faded by time. She was hurt while making this pinwheel for me, Annie said. I remember crying. I remember her singing to me so I wouldn't be afraid. Harold shifted slightly. Sir, scars and old stories can be arranged. Annie looked at Richard with pleading eyes. Dad, please don't listen to him right now. Please listen to me. Clara's voice trembled. Mr. Whitmore. Richard cut her off, louder this time. I told you. I did not give you permission to speak. Clara closed her mouth. Her eyes dropped to the floor. Annie looked wounded by her father's voice. Dad, please. She is not your enemy. Harold stepped closer to Richard. Sir, with all due respect, the entire staff is watching. If this continues, she will only bring more shame upon this family. You have already given your order. Please stand by it. Richard looked toward the security guard near the door. Take Mrs. Johnson to the staff quarters. She has 10 minutes to collect her personal belongings. After that, she leaves. No, Annie cried, stepping closer to Clara. If she leaves, I will go with her. Richard froze. Even Annie seemed frightened by the words she had just spoken. But she did not take them back. She looked at her father through her tears, still small in her pleading, still the daughter he loved, but this time she no longer had the strength to remain safely aside while Clara was taken away. Richard's expression changed. Annie, I don't want to leave you, she whispered, but I can't stand here and watch you throw my mother out of this house. Clara began to cry silently, one hand pressed against her chest as if she were trying to keep her heart from breaking apart. And for the first time since the argument began, Harold Pike had nothing left to say. Annie, what are you saying? Richard's voice was quieter than before, but the question still echoed through the foyer. Annie wiped her tears with the back of her hand. I'm saying I can't let you send her away, Dad. That is not what you just said. Richard slowly stepped toward her. You said if she leaves, you will go with her. Annie lowered her head. Her shoulders rose and fell once. I didn't mean that I wanted to leave you. Then what did you mean? I meant that I can't stand here and watch you throw her out as if she means nothing. Richard's face hardened at those words. No one said she means nothing. Harold leaned forward slightly. Sir, with all due respect, Mrs. Johnson has put your family in an impossible position. Annie looked at him, then back at Richard. She didn't put anyone in anything. I said it because it's the truth. Richard stared at his daughter as if he were trying to find the reason this morning had gone so terribly wrong. Do you understand what you are saying about this woman? Do you understand what that means? Annie nodded, but the movement was barely there. Yes, you understand that I legally adopted you. You understand that I raised you. You understand that I have been your father for the past 12 years. Her lips trembled. Yes, Dad. And now you are standing here telling me that the woman who cleans this house is your mother? Yes. Harold let out a careful breath. Sir, this is exactly why I urged immediate action. Miss Annie is overwhelmed. Mrs. Johnson has clearly been working on her emotions for quite some time. Clara lifted her head. I have never worked on that girl's emotions. Richard turned sharply toward her. I told you not to speak. Annie flinched. Clara fell silent again, but her eyes remained on Annie, full of guilt and pain. Richard saw that look, and it only made him angrier because it was not the look of a stranger. Dad, Annie said more softly, please don't be angry with her just because she looks at me that way. Richard turned back to her. How is she supposed to look at you? Annie pressed the broken pinwheel against her chest. As if she still remembers me. The answer struck him, but he refused to let it show. Harold stepped forward again. Sir, she must have shown Miss Annie something, perhaps a photograph, some old object, a keepsake. People can build stories around small things like that. It is a common tactic when money is involved. Annie shook her head. This isn't about money. How do you know, Lex? Because if she wanted money, she could have asked me for help a long time ago. But she never did. She could have told me who she was on the first day she met me. But she didn't. She tried to stay away from me. Richard gave a quiet, bitter laugh. By entering your room in the middle of the night? Annie's eyes filled with tears again. I had fallen asleep. That does not make this better. She only covered me with a blanket. Annie, she thought I didn't know. She thought I was asleep. Annie looked at Clara, her voice fading until it was almost a breath. Then she sang that song. Richard stopped. What song? Annie swallowed hard. The song I used to hum when I first came here. You even asked my music teacher if it was some kind of church hymn, remember? She didn't know. No one knew. Richard remembered. He had not thought about it in years. Annie, at 6 years old, sitting on the edge of a bed far too big for her small body. humming the same few notes over and over whenever rain tapped against the window. He had bought nightlights, weighted blankets, therapy sessions, anything that might help her feel less afraid. But he had never found out where that song came from. Annie looked up at him. She knew that song. Harold quickly said, "House staff can hear many things, sir. Miss Annie may have hummed that song recently." "That's not what I mean," Annie said. "Not like that." Richard's eyes moved toward Clara almost against his will. "Where did you learn that song?" Clara's lips parted, then closed again. She looked at Annie, as if asking for permission without words. Annie gave a small nod. Clara said, her voice trembling, "I used to sing it to her whenever the rain frightened her." Richard narrowed his eyes. "When?" Clara's voice grew even softer. "Before." Harold immediately stiffened. "Sir, she is leading you into a trap. Notice how she answers only enough to make you ask another question. That is not honesty. That is performance." Annie turned to Richard. Her hands lifted slightly, no longer arguing, only pleading. "Dad, please, I'm not asking you to believe everything right away. I'm only begging you not to send her away before you hear the truth." Richard looked at her hands. They were shaking. No matter how angry he was, he had never been able to bear seeing Annie tremble. When she was little, he had spent countless nights sitting on the floor beside her bed because she could not sleep unless she heard someone breathing nearby. He had signed the adoption papers with a steadier hand than he had now. He had once promised himself that little girl would never again have to stand in a room and beg to keep someone from being taken away. And yet here she was, standing right in front of him. Richard turned to the security guard. "Step back." Harold turned his head. "Sir?" I said, "Step back." The guard moved away from Clara. Annie let out a breath of relief, as if she had been holding it for several minutes. "Thank you, Dad." Richard's voice did not soften. "Don't thank me yet." Harold lowered his voice. "Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect, delaying this will only give Mrs. Johnson more time to make the situation worse." Richard looked at him. "You have made your position very clear, Harold. I only wish to protect your family." "My family is standing in front of me, Harold." That silenced him for a moment. Richard turned to Clara. "You will not leave this property until I know exactly what this is, but do not mistake that for trust." "I understand, sir," Clara said, "and you will answer every question I ask." Clara nodded. Annie stepped closer to Richard, her voice still trembling. "Can we sit down, Dad? Please. She looks like she's about to faint." Richard glanced at Clara. For the first time, he noticed how strangely tense her face was, and how white her knuckles had become from gripping the cloth in her hand. He was annoyed that he had noticed it at all. Compassion only made everything more chaotic. "Fine," he said. "The sitting room." Harold immediately spoke up. "Sir, I must object." Richard cut him off. "Not now." Annie gently took Clara's arm, careful, as if the woman might break if she touched her too firmly. Clara hesitated for a moment, then allowed Annie to guide her. The sight made Richard's chest tighten, not because it was wrong, because it looked too natural. They walked into the sitting room beside the foyer. It was the room Richard usually used to receive donors, lawyers, and city officials, not to hear truths that could overturn his entire life. Annie guided Clara to the edge of the sofa and sat beside her, but one of her hands remained extended toward Richard, as if she were afraid that if she stopped reaching for him, he would leave. Richard remained standing. "Start from the beginning," he said. Clara looked at Annie, then lowered her eyes to the floor. Annie whispered, "It's okay, Mom." The word was very small, almost accidental, but Richard heard it. So did Harold. Clara covered her mouth with one hand, and this time she could no longer hold back her tears. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a like. Comment where you are watching from and who you are watching with. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional and heartwarming stories. "Annie, what are you saying?" Richard's voice was quieter than before, but the question still echoed through the foyer. Annie wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I'm saying I can't let you send her away, Dad." "That is not what you just said." Richard slowly stepped toward her. "You said if she leaves, you will go with her." Annie lowered her head. Her shoulders rose and fell once. "I didn't mean that I wanted to leave you." "Then what did you mean?" "I meant that I can't stand here and watch you throw her out as if she means nothing." Richard's face hardened at those words. No one said she means nothing. Harold leaned forward slightly. Sir, with all due respect, Mrs. Johnson has put your family in an impossible position. Annie looked at him, then back at Richard. She didn't put anyone in anything. I said it because it's the truth. Richard stared at his daughter as if he were trying to find the reason this morning had gone so terribly wrong. Do you understand what you are saying about this woman? Do you understand what that means? Annie nodded, but the movement was barely there. Yes. You understand that I legally adopted you. You understand that I raised you. You understand that I have been your father for the past 12 years. Her lips trembled. Yes, Dad. And now you are standing here telling me that the woman who cleans this house is your mother? Yes. Harold let out a careful breath. Sir, this is exactly why I urged immediate action. Miss Annie is overwhelmed. Mrs. Johnson has clearly been working on her emotions for quite some time. Clara lifted her head. I have never worked on that girl's emotions. Richard turned sharply toward her. I told you not to speak. Annie flinched. Clara fell silent again. But her eyes remained on Annie, full of guilt and pain. Richard saw that look, and it only made him angrier because it was not the look of a stranger. Dad, Annie said more softly. Please don't be angry with her just because she looks at me that way. Richard turned back to her. How is she supposed to look at you? Annie pressed the broken pinwheel against her chest, as if she still remembers me. The answer struck him, but he refused to let it show. Harold stepped forward again. Sir, she must have shown Miss Annie something. Perhaps a photograph. Some old object. A keepsake. People can build stories around small things like that. It is a common tactic when money is involved. Annie shook her head. This isn't about money. How do you know? Richard asked. Because if she wanted money, she could have asked me for help a long time ago. But she never did. She could have told me who she was on the first day she met me. But she didn't. She tried to stay away from me. Richard gave a quiet, bitter laugh. By entering your room in the middle of the night? Annie's eyes filled with tears again. I had fallen asleep. That does not make this better. She only covered me with a blanket. Annie, she thought I didn't know. She thought I was asleep. Annie looked at Clara, her voice fading until it was almost a breath. Then she sang that song. Richard stopped. What song? Annie swallowed hard. The song I used to hum when I first came here. You even asked my music teacher if it was some kind of church hymn, remember? She didn't know. No one knew. Richard remembered. He had not thought about it in years. Annie at 6 years old, sitting on the edge of a bed far too big for her small body, humming the same few notes over and over whenever rain tapped against the window. He had bought nightlights, weighted blankets, therapy sessions, anything that might help her feel less afraid, but he had never found out where that song came from. Annie looked up at him. She knew that song. Harold quickly said, House staff can hear many things, sir. Miss Annie may have hummed that song recently. That's not what I mean, Annie said. Not like that. Richard's eyes moved toward Clara almost against his will. Where did you learn that song? Clara's lips parted, then closed again. She looked at Annie, as if asking for permission without words. Annie gave a small nod. Clara said, her voice trembling, I used to sing it to her whenever the rain frightened her. Richard narrowed his eyes. When? Clara's voice grew even softer. Before. Harold immediately stiffened. Sir, she is leading you into a trap. Notice how she answers only enough to make you ask another question. That is not honesty. That is performance. Annie turned to Richard. Her hands lifted slightly, no longer arguing, only pleading. Dad, please. I'm not asking you to believe everything right away. I'm only begging you not to send her away before you hear the truth. Richard looked at her hands. They were shaking. No matter how angry he was, he had never been able to bear seeing Annie tremble. When she was little, he had spent countless nights sitting on the floor beside her bed because she could not sleep unless she heard someone breathing nearby. He had signed the adoption papers with a steadier hand than he had now. He had once promised himself that little girl would never again have to stand in a room and beg to keep someone from being taken away. And yet here she was, standing right in front of him. Richard turned to the security guard. Step back. Harold turned his head. Sir? I said step back. The guard moved away from Clara. Annie let out a breath of relief, as if she had been holding it for several minutes. Thank you, Dad. Richard's voice did not soften. Don't thank me yet. Harold lowered his voice. Mr. Whitmore. With all due respect, delaying this will only give Mrs. Johnson more time to make the situation worse. Richard looked at him. You have made your position very clear, Harold. I only wish to protect your family. My family is standing in front of me, Harold. That silenced him for a moment. Richard turned to Clara. You will not leave this property until I know exactly what this is, but do not mistake that for trust. I understand, sir, Clara said, and you will answer every question I ask. Clara nodded. Annie stepped closer to Richard, her voice still trembling. Can we sit down, Dad? Please. She looks like she's about to faint. Richard glanced at Clara. For the first time, he noticed how strangely tense her face was, and how white her knuckles had become from gripping the cloth in her hand. He was annoyed that he had noticed it at all. Compassion only made everything more chaotic. Fine, he said. The sitting room. Harold immediately spoke up. Sir, I must object. Richard cut him off. Not now. Annie gently took Clara's arm. Careful, as if the woman might break if she touched her too firmly. Clara hesitated for a moment, then allowed Annie to guide her. The sight made Richard's chest tighten. Not because it was wrong, because it looked too natural. They walked into the sitting room beside the foyer. It was the room Richard usually used to receive donors, lawyers, and city officials. Not to hear truths that could overturn his entire life. Annie guided Clara to the edge of the sofa and sat beside her, but one of her hands remained extended toward Richard, as if she were afraid that if she stopped reaching for him, he would leave. Richard remained standing. Start from the beginning, he said. Clara looked at Annie, then lowered her eyes to the floor. Annie whispered, It's okay, Mom. The word was very small, almost accidental. But Richard heard it. So did Harold. Clara covered her mouth with one hand, and this time she could no longer hold back her tears. Clara tried to answer, but the word Annie had used still sat in the room. Mama. It had been so long since anyone had called her that, with love instead of accusation, that she could not move past it right away. She pressed both hands to her mouth, shoulders shaking, while Annie sat beside her with one hand on her sleeve. Scared to touch too much and scared to let go, Richard watched them from near the fireplace. His face was controlled again, but the control looked thin. Harold stood just inside the doorway, quiet for once, though his eyes kept moving from Clara to Annie and then to Richard, measuring the damage. Richard finally said, You said start from the beginning, so start. Clara nodded, wiping her face with the heel of her hand. Her name wasn't Whitmore then. Annie lowered her eyes. Richard's jaw moved once. What was it? Annie Mae Johnson, Clara said. That was the name on her birth certificate. Richard did not speak, but Annie felt his silence shift. She had never heard that name before. May. Clara had carried part of herself inside Annie's name and lost the right to say it. Clara looked at Richard, not Harold. I was 29 when I had her. I worked at a motel off Moreland Avenue during the week and washed dishes at a diner on weekends. I wasn't proud, but I was working. I had a little place. It wasn't much, but it had heat most days and a door that locked if you lifted it just right. Harold's mouth tightened, but Richard raised one finger before he could speak. Clara continued, I didn't drink, I didn't use, I didn't run around, I worked, but work doesn't always save you when the money is never enough. Annie listened without blinking, both hands folded in her lap now. One winter, I got sick, Clara said. Not hospital sick. Not at first. Just sick enough to miss shifts. Then the motel changed owners. The new manager brought in his cousin and cut my hours. The diner kept me on, but weekends don't pay rent. I fell behind. Then the landlord gave me 10 days. Richard's voice was hard, but quieter. Where was Annie during this? With me. Always with me when I could keep her there. Clara swallowed. When I couldn't, she stayed with a woman from the church. Good woman, but she had too many people in that house already. One afternoon, Annie had a fever, and I was at the diner. The woman called me, but my phone was dead. By the time I got back, somebody had called the county. Annie whispered, Was I sick? Clara turned to her. You had a fever, baby. You were crying for me and I wasn't there fast enough. That wasn't your fault, Annie said. Clara gave a small, broken smile. Mothers don't hear it that way. Richard looked away for a second. He knew that sentence. Not from Clara's life, but from his own fear. Parents had their own private court, and they were always both judge and guilty party. Clara took a breath. A woman from social services sat across from me in a county office. She wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. She said temporary placement. She said stability plan. She said if I found housing and steady work, we could review the case. Richard said, "And you signed?" Clara looked at him. "I signed because they told me signing was the way to get her back." Harold stepped in. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, that is a familiar story. There are always explanations after the fact." Annie's voice came out small. "Please stop." Harold softened his face. "Miss Annie, I only mean—" "I know what you mean," Annie said. "Please stop." Richard did not look at Harold. "Let her finish." Clara's hands twisted together. "I found work again. Not good work, but steady enough. I went back to the office. They told me the case had been moved. Then they told me Annie had been placed with a foster family outside my district. Then another. Every time I filled out a form, there was another desk, another name, another answer that sounded final but wasn't clear." Annie's lips trembled. "Did you look for me?" Clara turned fully toward her. "Every way I knew how. I called. I wrote. I took buses to offices where they told me I needed an appointment, then made appointments where they told me I had the wrong department. I kept every paper because paper was the only thing those people respected." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly at the phrase. "You have those papers?" "Yes, sir." "Here?" Clara nodded. "In my bag. In the staff room." Harold quickly said, "Convenient." Richard shot him a look. "Harold." The room went quiet again. Clara went on. "Then one day Mrs. Eleanor Grace, a woman who used to work in the system, told me Annie had been adopted. Legally. Final. She couldn't tell me much. She said the family had money. She said Annie was safe." Richard's expression changed, only a little. "I thought safe meant I should leave her alone," Clara said. "I told myself if she had a good bed, good food, good schools, then maybe God had done what I couldn't do. Maybe loving her meant staying away." Annie shook her head, tears spilling again. "No. Yes," Clara whispered. "That's what I told myself because I didn't know how to live otherwise." Richard's voice came low. "Then why come here?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment. "I saw her picture in the paper. She had won an art award. You were standing beside her, proud as any father could be. She looked healthy, grown, beautiful, and I should have been grateful from a distance. But I couldn't stop thinking. Did she still laugh the same? Did she still hate thunder? Did she still sleep curled on her side when she was tired?" Annie covered her mouth. "So I applied through a cleaning company," Clara said, not under a lie. "Clara Mae Johnson is my name. I didn't ask for upstairs work. I didn't ask to be near her. I took what they gave me. The first time I saw her walk through that hall, I almost dropped the bucket." Richard's hands closed at his sides. Clara looked at him, voice shaking. "I know how it sounds. I know what you must think. But I did not come to take her. I did not come to shame you. You raised her. I can see that. She says dad like she means it, and that cut me at first, but then it comforted me because it meant she had someone." Richard's face tightened again, but not with the same anger. Annie reached toward him. "Dad." He did not move closer, but he did not move away. Clara said, "I stayed because I was weak. Because one more day seeing her felt better than another year wondering. I told myself I would never tell her. I would just make sure she had tea when she was tired, and a light when it rained, and then I would go home." Harold spoke again, quieter this time. "And yet she found out." Clara nodded. "Yes, because grief is not as quiet as we think it is." Annie leaned toward Clara, crying openly now. "I heard you sing." Clara shut her eyes. Richard looked at Annie. "The lullaby?" Annie nodded. "The one from when I first came here. I didn't remember where it came from until she sang it." Clara whispered, "I thought you were asleep." "I was pretending," Annie said. "I was afraid if you knew, you'd leave." That broke something in Clara's face. Richard saw it. He did not want to be moved by it, but he was. Not convinced, not calm, but moved. He turned toward the hall. Bring her bag. Harold straightened. Sir, I can have security. No, Richard said. You will bring it yourself. Harold's face went still. Richard's voice lowered. And Harold, if one paper is missing from that bag, you will answer for it. For the first time that morning, Harold looked less certain. Annie held Clara's hand under both of hers and whispered, It's okay, Mama. Richard heard the word again. This time, he did not stop her. Harold did not move at first. He stood at the doorway with the careful stillness of a man deciding whether obedience would cost him less than resistance. Richard turned his head just enough to make the decision for him. The bag, Harold. Yes, sir. Harold left the sitting room without another word. His steps were measured across the foyer, but Annie heard the tightness in them. She kept holding Clara's hand. Clara's fingers were cold. Richard remained near the fireplace. He had not sat down. He looked like a man standing guard over a door he no longer knew whether to close or open. Annie wiped her face again. Dad. She keeps everything in a brown canvas bag. It's in the staff room, under the bench near the lockers. Richard's eyes moved to her. You knew where it was. Annie nodded, embarrassed. I saw it once. I wasn't snooping. She dropped it when she was carrying laundry, and I helped pick things up. Clara closed her eyes. Annie. I saw the picture, Annie said softly. Not all of it, just enough. Richard's voice grew quieter. How long have you known? Annie hesitated. Known for sure? Not long. And before that? I felt it. Richard looked away, jaw tight. Felt it. I know that sounds foolish. No, he said, though the word did not sound kind. It sounds young. Annie flinched. Clara felt it through her hand and squeezed gently, then let go at once, as if she had no right to comfort openly. Richard noticed. That made him angry again, not at Clara alone, but at the whole shape of the morning. Every small gesture between them seemed to carry a history he had not been told. Annie lowered her voice. Dad, I didn't want to hurt you. He turned back. Then why didn't you come to me? Because I was scared. Of me? Her face twisted. No. Of losing both of you. That answer reached him, but he gave it no place to rest. He looked toward the doorway instead. Harold returned carrying a worn brown canvas bag by 2 fingers, as if it were dirty. Behind him came Dolores, the older housekeeper, her face drawn with worry. Harold stopped just inside the room. I found it where Miss Annie said, he said. I did not open it. Richard held out his hand. Give it to Clara. Harold's mouth tightened. Sir, I really must advise. Give it to her. Harold walked over and placed the bag near Clara's feet, not in her hands. Annie reached down to pick it up, but Clara stopped her. No, baby. I'll do it. The word slipped out again. Harold heard it. Richard heard it. This time, no one corrected her. Clara pulled the bag onto her lap. The zipper caught halfway, and her hands shook as she worked it free. From inside, she took a folded sweater, a bus pass, a small bottle of aspirin, a packet of tissues, and finally a thick envelope wrapped with a rubber band, so old it had begun to crack. Richard watched every movement. Clara held the envelope but did not open it. Before I show you these, I need to say one thing. Richard's eyes hardened. Say it. I know you love her. I saw it. Every morning, every time she left for school, every time you asked if she ate, every time you stood at the window until her car pulled out. Clara looked at Annie, then back at him. I hated you for a while before I met you. Then I saw how you looked after her, and hating you became harder. Richard did not answer. Clara continued. I'm not here to undo what you did for her. Harold gave a dry little sound. A touching speech. Dolores spoke from the doorway before Richard could. Mr. Pike, let the woman talk. Everyone turned. Dolores looked nervous, but she did not step back. Harold's eyes narrowed. This does not involve you. It involves the house, Dolores said, and some of us have seen more than we said. Richard looked at her. What have you seen? Harold quickly said, Sir, staff gossip is hardly reliable at a moment like this. Richard's voice cut through him. I asked Dolores. Dolores folded her hands in front of her apron. I saw Mr. Pike change Mrs. Johnson's schedule after she wouldn't ride home with him. I saw him give her 3 rooms to clean, then tell you she was slow. I saw him take a silver frame from the den. and put it on her cart. When I asked why, he told me to mind my position. Harold's face flushed. That is a lie. Dolores looked at Richard. I'm 64 years old, sir. I don't need to lie to keep a job I was planning to retire from. Annie's mouth parted slightly. Clara looked down, as if shame could still be hers even when the accusation was not. Richard turned to Harold. Is that true? Harold straightened. I may have tested her honesty after observing concerning behavior. You planted something on her cart? I protected your household. Richard took one step toward him. Did you plant it? Harold looked at Annie, then Clara, then back at Richard. Nothing was taken. That is not what I asked. Harold said nothing. Richard's face settled into a coldness Annie knew well. It was the expression he wore when a business partner had lied and did not yet know the conversation was over. Clara opened the envelope with care. Mr. Whitmore, these are not perfect papers. Poor people rarely get perfect papers. But they are what I have. She laid them on the table one by one. A birth record with Annie Mae Johnson printed in black ink. A hospital bracelet flattened and saved in a plastic sleeve. Copies of letters Clara had sent to county offices. Returned envelopes. A worn photograph of Clara holding Annie at 5. The bamboo pinwheel still whole. A note from Eleanor Grace, confirming she had helped Clara search for adoption information years after the placement became final. Richard did not touch the papers at first. He read them from where he stood, as if closeness might make them more real. Annie whispered, Dad? He picked up the birth record. The room seemed to shrink around that single sheet. Richard read the name, then the date, then Clara's full name printed beneath Mother. His thumb moved once along the paper's edge. Harold said too quickly, Documents can be forged. Richard did not look up. Not by a woman you said was too lazy to finish laundry. Harold went silent. Clara's eyes filled again. I did lose her, Mr. Whitmore. But I did not throw her away. Annie covered her mouth, holding back a sob. Richard looked at the hospital bracelet next, then the photograph. He had seen Annie's face at 6, frightened and guarded. In the picture, she was younger, smiling with a freedom he had never seen in those early adoption days. Clara stood beside her, tired, thin, happy. Richard set the photograph down slowly. For the first time, his voice had no anger in it, only strain. Why didn't anyone tell me her mother was looking? Clara gave a sad laugh. Men with money get clean files. Women like me get waiting rooms. Annie reached for Richard's hand again. This time, after a long moment, he let her take it. Richard let Annie hold his hand for several seconds before he slowly pulled away. He did not do it harshly. But Annie felt the distance as soon as his fingers left hers. Clara saw it too and lowered her eyes, as if she had caused a pain she could not mend. Richard picked up the photograph again. The girl in it was Annie. No question. Younger, thinner, smiling with a gap in her front teeth. Both hands wrapped around the bamboo pinwheel. Clara stood beside her in a faded yellow shirt, one arm around Annie's shoulders, the other hand bandaged at the wrist. He set the picture down and looked at Clara. You had 12 years. Clara's face tightened. Yes, sir. 12 years to contact me. I know. You knew where she was. Not at first. But eventually. Clara nodded. Eventually. Richard's voice stayed calm, and that made it harder to hear. And instead of calling my attorney, instead of contacting the adoption agency, instead of making a lawful request, you came into my home under a cleaning contract. Annie whispered, Dad. She was scared. Richard did not look away from Clara. I'm asking her. Clara folded her hands together. I did try the lawful way. I wrote letters. I called offices. I went where they told me to go. Every answer led to another door. When I finally learned enough, Annie was already your daughter in every legal way. I was told. I had no standing. You should have come to me. Clara's eyes lifted then, tired and honest. Would you have opened the door? Richard did not answer at once. Harold seized the pause. Sir, forgive me, but this proves the point. She knew proper channels were closed, so she found a side entrance. That is not fear. That is planning. Annie shook her head. Stop twisting everything. Harold turned to her with a soft voice. Miss Annie, no one is twisting anything. Your heart is kind. That is why she chose you. Clara's head snapped up. I did not choose her. I gave birth to her. The room froze. Richard looked at Clara, and the force of those words landed between them. Annie began to cry again. Quieter this time. The kind of crying she seemed ashamed of because it made her feel younger than she was. Clara immediately softened. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say it like that. No, Annie whispered. Don't be sorry. Richard picked up the hospital bracelet. The plastic had yellowed. The printed name was faint, but still readable. Annie Mae Johnson, female, mother, Clara Johnson, a date, a hospital in Atlanta. He had signed Annie's school forms, medical releases, passport paperwork, college applications. He had written father beside his name so many times that it had become part of his hand. Now this little strip of plastic sat in his palm, reminding him there had been a first form he had never seen. He placed it on the table. Harold, leave us. Harold blinked. Sir? You heard me. I don't think that is wise. Richard turned his head slowly. I did not ask what you think. Harold's face shifted, just enough for the mask to slip. After all these years, you're sending me out because of her? Richard's eyes narrowed. Because I told you to leave. Dolores, still by the door, looked down to hide the smallest sign of satisfaction. Harold straightened his jacket. Very well, sir. I'll be in the hall if you need me. No, Richard said. Go to your office. Do not speak to staff. Do not call anyone. I will deal with you later. Harold's mouth opened, then closed. He gave a stiff nod and left. His footsteps faded, but the damage he had done remained. Annie sat closer to Clara, though not quite touching her now. She looked at Richard with a trembling kind of hope. Thank you. Richard rubbed his thumb across the edge of the table, a small movement that showed more strain than his face did. Do not thank me for sending a man out of a room. I still don't know what I'm looking at. You're looking at the truth, Annie said. I'm looking at papers, memories, and a great deal of pain. That's what truth can look like. Richard looked at her then. There was surprise in his face, and something like sorrow. When did you start sounding older than me? Annie almost smiled, but it broke before it formed. Sometime this morning. Clara turned toward Richard. Mr. Whitmore, I know what I did was wrong. Taking that job, without telling you. Being near her, keeping quiet. I know, but every time I tried to leave, I'd hear her in the hallway, or I'd see her carrying those art folders, or I'd notice she hadn't eaten, and I would tell myself one more day. Just one more day to make sure she was all right. Richard's voice roughened. You were not the one responsible for making sure she was all right. No, sir, you were, and you did it. The simple respect in her answer unsettled him more than any argument could have. He had prepared himself for accusation, for demands, for some attempt to take credit or claim injury. Clara gave him none of that. She gave him the one thing he did not know how to fight, gratitude. Annie reached for him again. Dad, I'm not asking you to stop being my father. His eyes closed for half a second. That is easy for you to say. No, it isn't. Her voice cracked. Because I'm scared too. I'm scared if I love her out loud, you'll think I love you less. Richard looked at the papers on the table. Do you? No. Annie answered so fast it almost hurt. No, Dad, you're my dad. You came to every recital. You sat with me when I couldn't sleep. You taught me how to drive even though I almost hit the mailbox. You're my dad. Clara gave a quiet, broken breath. She had not known those things. She was grateful for them and wounded by them at the same time. Annie turned to her. And she's my mother. I don't know how to make that easy for anybody. Richard stood still for a long moment. Then he said, Nothing about this will be decided in this room today. Annie's face fell. What does that mean? It means Clara will not be removed from the property tonight. Clara looked up sharply. Richard continued. She will stay in the guest house until I verify these documents and speak with the adoption attorney who handled your case. Annie's relief came out as a shaky breath. Thank you, Dad. Richard held up a hand. I am not making promises beyond tonight. I know. He turned to Clara. You will not enter Annie's room. You will not move through this house without permission. Not until I understand what has happened. Clara nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Annie looked hurt by the terms, but she did not argue. She knew they were standing on a narrow bridge, and one wrong word could break it. Richard gathered the papers into a careful stack. Dolores, please prepare the guest house. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Dolores left at once. Clara stood slowly. Mr. Whitmore? He looked at her. Thank you for not sending me away. Richard's answer came after a long pause. I didn't do it for you. Clara nodded, accepting even that. Annie stepped toward Clara, then stopped and looked at Richard for permission without meaning to. The small gesture hurt all three of them. Richard saw it, his voice softened by a fraction. Go ahead. Annie crossed the room and hugged Clara. Clara held her carefully at first, then tighter when Annie began to cry into her shoulder. Richard turned away, not because he was angry now, but because watching them made him feel as if a door had opened inside his own house, and he had been standing outside it for years. Richard left the sitting room with the papers in his hand, but he did not go far. He stopped in the hall outside, where no one could see his face, and stood there listening to the low sound of Annie crying against Clara's shoulder. He told himself he was giving them privacy. The truth was harder. He did not know what to do with the sound. For 12 years, when Annie cried, he had been the one she reached for. He knew which mug she wanted when she had a sore throat, which blanket she took to the sofa after bad dreams, which side of the car she preferred when rain made the windows loud. He had built his life around knowing those things. Now Clara knew some of them from a time before him, and Richard felt the old fear rise in his chest. Not anger this time. Not exactly. Loss. He looked down at the documents. Annie Mae Johnson. Clara Mae Johnson. The ink was old. The paper creased, but nothing about it felt false. That bothered him more than if it had looked fake. Fraud had corners. This had age. Dolores came from the side hall, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. The guest house is ready, sir. Fresh sheets, towels, and I put coffee in the cabinet. Richard nodded. Thank you. She waited. He noticed. Is there something else? Dolores glanced toward the sitting room. That woman has been working here 7 months. She never raised her voice at anybody. Never took so much as a biscuit unless somebody offered. Harold had people thinking she was lazy, but she did more than her share. Richard's mouth tightened. Why didn't anyone tell me? Dolores gave him a careful look. She had worked in large homes too long to answer without thinking. Because Harold was the one who spoke to you, Mr. Whitmore. The rest of us spoke to him. That answer landed cleanly. Richard looked toward Harold's office down the corridor. Where is he? In his office, I believe. Make sure he stays there. Dolores nodded, then softened her voice. Miss Annie is a good young woman. She's not trying to wound you. I know that, but he did not know how to feel as if he knew it. When Richard returned to the sitting room, Annie stepped away from Clara at once, wiping her cheeks quickly, as though she had been caught doing something wrong. That hurt him too. You don't have to stop, he said. Annie's face crumpled a little. I didn't want to make you feel bad. Richard almost laughed, but there was no humor in him. We may be past that. Clara stood. I should go to the guest house now. Annie reached for her sleeve. Can I walk with her? Richard looked at the papers in his hand, then at Annie. To the door. Not inside. Not tonight. Annie nodded, trying to accept the little she was given. Okay. Clara seemed ready to refuse even that, but Annie's fingers held the edge of her sleeve with such quiet need that she could not pull away. They crossed the foyer together, slower than necessary. Richard followed a few steps behind. It felt strange to walk through his own house like a guest to someone else's grief. At the side entrance, Clara stopped and turned to Annie. I'll be right out back, Clara said, just across the yard. Annie nodded. Will you be okay? Clara smiled through tired eyes. I've slept in worse places than a Whitmore guest house. Annie did not smile. I know. Clara touched Annie's hand, then drew back. I'm sorry. Please stop saying sorry for everything. Clara looked at Richard before answering. Some habits take time. Richard opened the side door. Evening air came in, cool and damp, carrying the smell of cut grass and wet stone from the garden paths. Clara stepped outside, then paused. Mr. Whitmore, she said. He met her eyes. I know you don't trust me. You shouldn't, not yet, but whatever you think of me, Don't punish Annie for asking questions I should have answered years ago. Richard's voice was flat. I do not punish my daughter. No, sir, Clara said gently. But sometimes fear does the punishing for us. She walked toward the guest house before he could answer. Annie stood at the door until Clara reached the small porch and Dolores switched on the light inside. Only then did Richard close it. Annie turned to him, her face worn and young in a way that made him ache. Are you mad at me? No. Are you sure? I am angry at the situation. I am angry I was not told. I am angry that a man I trusted may have used my concern for you to hurt someone. He paused. But I am not angry at you. She looked down. You sounded like you hated her. I don't know her. She's not bad. You don't know all of her either. Annie accepted that with a small nod. I know enough not to let her be thrown out. Richard's eyes closed briefly. You said you would go with her. I was scared. So was I. That surprised her. Richard put the envelope on the hall table and rubbed one hand over his face. When you came to live here, you barely spoke for 3 weeks. You kept that broken pinwheel under your pillow. Every time it rained, you hummed that song until you fell asleep. I asked everyone where it came from. No one knew. Annie stepped closer. You remember that? I remember everything about you. Her tears came back, but softer now. Then please believe me when I say loving her doesn't take me away from you. Richard looked at her for a long time. I am trying. I know. From down the hall, a door opened. Harold appeared. Jacket buttoned, face composed, though his eyes were tight. Sir, he said. I thought perhaps you might need assistance calling the attorney. Richard turned. I told you to stay in your office. I did, but given the seriousness of this matter, you felt entitled to ignore me. Harold stopped. No, sir. Richard stepped toward him. Dolores says you changed Clara's schedule after she refused personal attention from you. Harold's face hardened for the length of a breath. Then the servant's mask returned. Dolores is mistaken. She also says you placed a silver frame on Clara's cart. That was a test of procedure. A test you did not authorize with me. I was protecting your home. Richard's voice dropped. You keep saying that. Because it is true. No, you were protecting your pride. Harold's mouth opened, then closed. Annie stood behind Richard, hugging herself. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired, and that made Richard's voice turn colder. You will leave the property tonight, he said. Dolores will collect your keys. My attorney will review your employment contract tomorrow. Harold's face went pale. After 16 years? After this morning, Harold looked past him toward Annie. Miss Annie, you may not see it now, but I was trying to save your father from a mistake. Annie's voice was small. You tried to make him throw my mother away. Harold had no answer to that. Richard called security, but there was no scene. Harold left through the same side entrance Clara had used, carrying one leather briefcase and the remains of his dignity. Annie watched from the hall, then looked away before the door closed. Later, Richard walked Annie upstairs. Outside her bedroom, she paused. Dad? Yes? Can I see her tomorrow? Richard's first answer was no. It rose fast, old and protective. But he thought of Clara crossing the yard alone, of Annie's hand on his, of the word Mama breaking open a room. Yes, he said. After breakfast. With me there. Annie nodded. That's fair. Fair. He almost told her none of this was fair. Instead, he touched her shoulder. Try to sleep. She looked at him with tired eyes. You too. Richard went downstairs after her door closed. He sat alone in his study with Clara's papers spread across the desk. Near midnight, rain began tapping the windows. From upstairs came a faint sound, so soft he almost missed it. Annie was humming. This time, Richard knew where the song had come from, and the knowing did not comfort him. It simply made the house feel larger and lonelier than it had that morning. Morning came without mercy. Richard had not slept more than an hour. He sat at his desk until dawn with Clara's papers arranged in front of him, then rearranged, then placed back in the same order. Birth record, hospital bracelet, county letters, returned envelopes, photograph, a note signed by Eleanor Grace. At 6:30, he called his attorney. By 7, he had learned enough to know the papers were not easy to dismiss. The adoption had been legal. Annie's placement had passed through the county system. Her birth mother's name had appeared in early records and then disappeared into the clean final file Richard had received. No one had lied to him exactly. They had simply given him a version with all the rough edges trimmed off. That made him feel worse. At breakfast, Annie came downstairs in the same sweatshirt she had worn the day before. Her hair was tied loosely, her eyes swollen from crying. She paused at the dining room entrance as if she needed permission to enter her own morning. Richard saw it and hated that he had helped create it. "Come eat," he said. She sat across from him. Dolores placed oatmeal, toast, berries, and coffee on the table, then left them alone. Annie looked toward the window that faced the guest house. "She's awake," Richard said. Annie looked at him quickly. "You saw her?" "I saw the light on." "Oh, she'll join us after breakfast." Annie's hands folded in her lap. "You said I could see her after breakfast." "I did. With you there." "Yes." She nodded. "That's okay." Richard set down his coffee. "You don't have to act grateful for every inch I give you." Annie's eyes lowered. "I don't want you to take the inch back." The sentence struck harder than he expected. He pushed his plate away. "Annie, I'm sorry. Stop apologizing." She gave a faint, tired smile. "You and Clara keep telling me that." Hearing Clara's name at his table still felt strange. Richard forced himself not to react. "I spoke to Paul Harris this morning." "Our attorney?" "Yes. He handled the final adoption paperwork." Annie's whole body tensed. "What did he say?" "That the documents Clara brought appear consistent with the early file." Annie's mouth trembled. "So, you believe me?" Richard answered carefully. "I believe there is enough truth here that I have no right to shut the door on it." It was not the answer she wanted, but she accepted it because it was more than she had last night. After breakfast, Richard walked with Annie through the back hall and across the stone path to the guest house. The yard still held last night's rain. The grass was wet, and the morning air smelled of soil and magnolia leaves. Annie slowed near the porch. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Please don't question her like she's on trial." Richard looked at the small guest house, then at his daughter. "I need answers." "I know, just... She already thinks she did everything wrong." Richard did not answer. He knocked. Clara opened the door almost at once. She wore the same gray work pants, but Dolores had brought her a clean cardigan. Her hair was pulled back, and though she had washed her face, grief still sat plainly around her eyes. "Good morning," she said. Annie's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked suddenly young and unsure, as if the word mama was too large to use in daylight. Clara understood. "Morning, Annie." Richard stepped inside first. The guest house was small but comfortable, with a sofa, a kitchenette, and a round table near the window. Clara had not unpacked. Her brown bag sat by the door, ready to be carried away. Annie noticed. "You packed?" "I didn't unpack." "Why?" Clara gave a soft breath. "Habit." Richard took that in and said nothing. They sat at the table. Annie sat between them at first, then seemed to realize what it meant, and moved slightly closer to Richard, as if to reassure him. Clara saw and lowered her gaze. Richard saw and felt no comfort from it. He placed the papers on the table. "I spoke with the attorney. I will verify everything properly. Until then, I need to understand what you expect from Annie." Clara's answer came quickly. "Nothing. That is not realistic. I don't mean I expect not to love her. I mean I don't expect her to fix what happened to me." Annie's eyes filled again. "I want to know you." Clara's face folded, but she held herself steady. "Then we go slow." Richard looked at Clara. "You entered my house knowing who she was. You did not tell me. You allowed my daughter to form an attachment without knowing why. Do you understand why I see that as a violation?" "Yes, sir." Annie started to speak, but Clara touched the table lightly, stopping her. "Your father is right to ask that." Richard was not prepared for her agreement. Clara continued. "I told myself I was protecting her. Maybe I was protecting myself too. If she hated me from far away, I could imagine it. If she hated me to my face, I didn't know how I would keep standing." Annie whispered, "I don't hate you." "I know that now." Clara looked at her with a small, aching smile. "But fear doesn't wait for facts." Richard sat back, then caught himself and straightened. He had promised himself not to be softened by every honest sentence. "What do you want, Clara?" She looked at him for a long moment. to hear her voice sometimes, to know if she's eating, to maybe sit with her long enough for her to ask what she needs to ask. If she wants me gone after that, I'll go. No, Annie said at once. Clara turned to her. You don't have to decide today. I already decided I don't want you gone. Richard rubbed his forehead. Annie, this is what I mean. You are moving faster than the situation can hold. She looked at him, hurt. I waited 12 years without knowing I was waiting. He had no answer. A knock came at the open door. Dolores stood on the porch. Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Eleanor Grace is at the gate. She says Clara asked her to come if things ever came out. Clara went still. I called her last night. I didn't think she'd come this early. Richard rose. Let her in. Mrs. Eleanor Grace arrived 10 minutes later in a navy church dress, walking with a cane, and the kind of presence that made even Richard feel he should stand straighter. She looked at Clara first, then Annie, then Richard. So, Eleanor said, lowering herself into the chair Richard offered. The Lord finally got tired of everybody whispering. Annie gave a tiny laugh through her tears. Eleanor took her hand. You must be Annie. Yes, ma'am. I knew your name before it changed. Eleanor's eyes softened. Your mama came to my office more times than the records show. Richard sat across from her. You worked in the county system? 31 years. Retired before my mouth got me fired. Clara murmured. Mrs. Grace. What? It's true. Eleanor turned to Richard. You got a clean adoption, Mr. Whitmore. I'm not here to challenge that. But clean doesn't always mean complete. Richard listened. Eleanor tapped the papers. This woman tried. Not perfectly. Poor folks don't get perfect paths. She tried with bus fare, bad phones, wrong offices, and people telling her to wait until waiting became another way of saying no. Annie cried silently. Richard looked at Clara, then at Annie. Why did no one contact me? Eleanor's mouth tightened. Because once a file is final, everybody protects the final file. It makes the system look tidy. Tidy, Richard repeated. Yes, sir. Tidy can bury a lot. For a while, no one spoke. Then Annie reached one hand toward Richard and the other toward Clara. She did not force them together. She simply held both hands open. Please, she said. I don't need everything fixed today. I just need nobody to leave. Richard looked at her open hand. Clara looked at the other. Slowly, Clara took Annie's left hand. After a longer moment, Richard took her right. Annie bowed her head, crying harder now, but quieter. Richard did not feel healed. He did not feel ready. But with Annie's hand trembling in his, he understood one thing clearly. Love was no longer something he could protect by closing doors. Eleanor Grace did not hurry the silence. She had the patience of someone who had spent half her life across from frightened mothers, tired caseworkers, and men in suits who thought a file could explain a family. She kept one hand over Annie's. Now, nobody in this room is going to solve 12 years before lunch. Richard looked at her. I am not trying to solve it before lunch. No, sir. You're trying to control it before lunch. That's different. Annie drew in a small breath, as if she feared Richard might take offense. He did not. He only looked at Eleanor longer. Clara murmured, Mrs. Grace. Eleanor patted Annie's hand once and released it. Don't Mrs. Grace me. You called because you needed somebody old enough to say what everybody else is afraid to say. Richard's mouth tightened, but not in anger. Then say it. Eleanor turned fully toward him. You did right by Annie. I can see that in how she looks at you even when she's scared. But doing right by her does not erase what came before you, and Clara loving her first does not erase what you gave her after. Annie wiped her cheek. That's what I've been trying to say. I know, honey, Eleanor said, but sometimes young women say truth with tears, and grown men hear threat. Richard's eyes moved to Annie. She looked tired, small in the chair, still holding Clara with one hand and him with the other. His anger had been easier when he could call it protection. It was harder now that it had Annie trembling between two people she loved. He let go of her hand first, gently this time. We need rules. Annie's face fell. Dad, not punishment. Rules. He looked at Clara. Until the documents are fully verified, you stay in the guest house, not as staff. You will not clean, cook, or work in this house. Clara looked startled. Mr. Whitmore, I need the job. You will be paid through the end of the month. After that, we will discuss something fair. I'm not asking for money. I know. That is why I'm offering it as wages owed, not charity. Clara lowered her eyes. Annie looked at him, as if he had opened a window in a room where she had been struggling to breathe. Richard continued. Annie may see you each day, but not in secret. No more hallways. No more midnight visits. No more hiding. Clara nodded. Yes, sir, Annie said. Can I talk to her alone? Richard paused. Eleanor tapped her cane lightly against the floor. Mr. Whitmore, the girl is asking for privacy, not rebellion. Annie looked down at the table. I just have questions I can't ask with everyone listening. Richard heard what she did not say. Questions about why Clara gave her up. Questions about whether she cried. Questions about birthdays, fever, rain, that song. Questions a father could love her through but not answer for her. Half an hour, he said. In the garden, doors open, I'll be in the house. Annie nodded fast, grateful and afraid to show too much of it. Thank you. Clara looked pained. Annie, you don't have to ask everything today. I know. Annie's voice was thin. But I need to ask one thing. Richard rose. I'll give you that time. Eleanor also stood, slower, using her cane. I'll sit in the kitchen with Dolores. She promised me coffee, and at my age I take promises seriously. That almost made Annie smile. A few minutes later, Annie and Clara sat outside on the back patio. The rain had left the cushions damp at the edges, so Clara tried to stand again and fetch a towel. Annie caught her sleeve. Please don't serve me right now. Clara froze, then sat. I don't know how to sit here as anything else. You can sit here as my mother. Clara's face broke a little. I don't know if I've earned that word. Annie looked at the wet garden, the hedges, the small guest house beyond the path. I called you Mama last night without thinking. I heard. Did it hurt? Clara's eyes filled. It hurt like water after thirst. Good and painful at the same time. Annie nodded, though she did not fully understand. Did you remember my birthdays? All of them. What did you do? Clara folded her hands. Some years I bought a cupcake from the grocery store and put one candle in it. Not 18 candles. Just one. I told myself it stood for one more year you were somewhere in this world. Annie pressed her lips together. Did you sing? Every year. The same song? Clara nodded. Annie looked at her wrist. Can I see the scar again? Clara offered her hand. Annie touched the mark lightly, not the way she had in the foyer, proving something, but as if reading a line from a letter. I remembered it wrong, Annie said. What do you mean? I thought the blood was my fault. I thought I had moved or cried or made you cut yourself. No, baby. Clara's voice went firm at once. No. You were sitting at the table eating peaches from a can. I was showing off, trying to split the bamboo too thin. That knife slipped because I was careless. Annie let out a shaky breath. I carried that feeling for years and didn't even know what it was. Clara covered Annie's hand with hers. Then give it back to me. That was never yours. Inside the house, Richard stood near the kitchen window. He did not hear every word, only pieces. Cupcake, candle, scar. Give it back to me. Dolores poured coffee for Eleanor at the breakfast table. You think he'll come around? Eleanor looked toward Richard's back. He already turned. He just hasn't admitted his feet moved. Richard heard her and chose not to respond. His phone buzzed. Paul Harris, his attorney, had sent a message. Early review, supports authenticity. Need county archive request to confirm full timeline. No indication Clara Johnson's parental claim is fabricated. Richard read it twice. Fabricated. He hated the word. Hated that part of him had wanted it to be true because a lie would have been simpler. A lie could be removed from the property. A truth had to be lived with. Outside, Annie leaned into Clara's shoulder. Clara did not wrap both arms around her at first. She looked toward the window, saw Richard, and waited. That waiting said more than any apology could. Richard gave one small nod. Only then did Clara hold Annie. Eleanor came to stand beside him. There's your first lesson. Richard did not look away from them. What lesson is that? She waited for you. A woman trying to steal your daughter would not have done that. His throat tightened. I don't know how to share her. Eleanor's voice softened. You don't share people, Mr. Whitmore. You share time. You share meals. You share the work of loving them well. Richard watched Annie cry against Clara, then laugh through the tears at something Clara said. It was a sound he knew and did not know. After a long while, he stepped outside. Annie straightened quickly. Did we go too long? No. Clara started to rise. Stay seated, Richard said. She obeyed, but uneasily. Richard looked at both of them. Paul says the documents appear authentic. Annie's hand flew to her mouth. Clara closed her eyes. I'm requesting the full county archive, Richard continued. There will be more questions. Some of them may hurt. But for now, Clara stays. Annie began crying again, but this time relief carried it. Richard added, and tomorrow morning, we will all have breakfast at the same table. Clara looked at him. Mr. Whitmore, I don't want to make things harder. They are already hard, he said. We may as well stop pretending separate rooms make them easier. Eleanor smiled from the doorway. That almost sounded wise. Richard glanced at her. Almost? Don't rush greatness. Annie laughed softly. Clara did too, through tears. Richard stood there on the damp patio, with his daughter between the woman who had raised her in safety and the woman who had loved her from the far side of loss, and he understood that the house had not grown smaller because Clara entered it. It had only become honest about the rooms he had never opened. Breakfast the next morning did not feel like breakfast. It felt like everyone had been invited to sit at the same table as a truth too large for the plates. Dolores made grits, scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, sliced peaches, and coffee. She placed everything down without fuss, then stepped away, but not before giving Clara a look that said she did not have to jump up and help. Clara still rose halfway when the coffee pot came near her. Richard noticed. Sit down, Clara. She sat at once, then seemed embarrassed by how quickly she obeyed. Annie looked from one to the other and tried a small smile. This is weird. Richard picked up his coffee. That may be the most accurate thing said in this house all week. The corner of Clara's mouth moved. Annie let out a quiet laugh, then covered it, as if laughter needed permission too. Richard heard that small laugh and felt the room loosen by one thread. Clara did not touch much food. She held her fork, set it down, picked it up again. Annie watched her and pushed the bowl of peaches closer. You used to give me peaches from a can, right? Clara's hand stopped. When I could afford them. I remembered that last night. Richard looked at Annie. You remembered it? Or Clara told you? Annie's face fell a little. I remembered. Richard regretted the question before the silence finished forming. I'm sorry. That sounded like an accusation. It's okay, Annie said, though it clearly wasn't. Clara spoke carefully. Mr. Whitmore, you don't have to apologize for wanting to know what is true. I need to learn how to ask without making her feel cross-examined. Annie looked at him then. Thank you. He nodded once, not trusting himself with more. The morning might have settled into something almost peaceful if Richard's phone had not buzzed beside his plate. He glanced at the screen. His attorney. Then another message arrived from the front gate. Harold Pike was outside. Richard read the message twice, his expression changing so little that only Annie caught it. What happened? She asked. Harold is at the gate. Clara's fork touched the plate with a small sound. Annie went still. Why? Richard stood. I'll find out. Clara rose too. I should go back to the guest house. No, Annie said too quickly. Richard looked at Clara. Stay here. Clara hesitated. Mr. Whitmore, if he came because of me, he came because he has not understood he no longer gives orders in this house. Richard left before anyone could answer. At the front entrance, Harold stood just beyond the open door, not on the step. He was dressed neatly, as always, but without the authority the suit had once seemed to give him. A security man stood nearby. Harold held a folder against his chest. Sir, Harold said, I apologize for arriving without notice. You were told not to return without a call from my attorney. I understand. But I could not leave matters as they were. I brought records of Mrs. Johnson's conduct. Schedules, incident notes, concerns. I documented. Richard looked at the folder. Concerns you created? Harold's face tightened. That is unfair. Unfair is a mild word for what happened here. Harold lowered his voice. Sir, that woman has turned your daughter against me in a single day. Annie spoke before Clara did, because Clara prepared her to speak. Richard's patience thinned. You should choose your next words with care. Harold stepped closer, then stopped when the guard shifted. I gave 16 years to this family. I know how people approach wealth. They come softly first. A sad story. A familiar song. A scar. Then comes money. Then comes control. I was trying to protect you from humiliation. Richard looked at the man he had trusted with household keys, private schedules, personal routines. He saw, maybe for the first time, how much of Harold's loyalty had depended on being near power and resenting anyone below him who refused his hand. You were protecting yourself, Richard said. Harold's face hardened. She rejected a kindness from me and then acted as though I had insulted her. After that, I watched more closely. That is all. You punished her. I disciplined staff. You lied to me. Harold did not answer. Richard took the folder from him and handed it unopened to the guard. Give this to my attorney. Harold seemed relieved for a second. Richard added, along with a note that every claim inside is to be checked against staff statements and camera logs. The relief died. Sir, I would caution you against believing kitchen gossip over a man who stood by you for years. Richard stepped closer, voice low. A man who stands by me does not use my fear to make me cruel. For the first time, Harold looked truly wounded. Not because he felt guilt, but because Richard had named him plainly. You will not contact Annie, Richard said. You will not contact Clara. You will not contact anyone on my staff, except through counsel. If you try to enter this property again without permission, you will deal with police, and not with me. Harold swallowed. After 16 years, that is all? No, Richard said. After 16 years, that is mercy. He closed the door before Harold could speak again. When Richard returned to the dining room, Annie had not eaten. Clara was standing near the window, her hands locked together. Dolores hovered by the sideboard, pretending to adjust napkins. He's gone, Richard said. Annie's eyes searched his face. Is he coming back? Not into this house. Clara looked down. I'm sorry this has cost you someone you trusted. Richard placed both hands on the back of his chair. He cost himself that. Clara nodded, but she still looked troubled. Men like Mr. Pike don't always stop because a door closes. Annie's face tightened with worry. Richard caught it and softened his tone. There will be no scene, no shouting from gates, no calls reaching you, no surprises. I will handle it properly. Annie whispered. I don't want him hurting you either. Richard's expression changed. Me? He knew exactly what to say to scare you. Clara looked at Annie with quiet pride and sadness. Richard sat down again. Yes. He did. That admission made the room feel different. Richard had not surrendered authority. He had done something harder for him. He had admitted someone had used it. Dolores poured him fresh coffee. Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Grace called. She said she can come by this afternoon if Miss Annie wants her. Annie looked at Clara, then Richard. Could she? Richard nodded. Yes. Clara touched the edge of the table. Maybe Mrs. Grace can help explain the old records better than I can. And maybe, Annie said softly, we can talk about what happens next without everybody being scared. Richard looked at her, then at Clara. Scared may be part of it for a while. Annie gave a small nod. Then we can be scared at the same table. Clara's eyes filled again, but she smiled through it. Richard picked up his fork at last. Eat your breakfast, Annie. She almost laughed. You still sound like Dad. I have no plan to stop. Clara lowered her gaze. And this time her smile stayed. Richard noticed. Annie noticed too. For the first time since the word mother had split the foyer open, breakfast continued. Not easily, not comfortably, but with all three still seated, and that was more than any of them had believed possible the morning before. By afternoon, the house had settled into a kind of careful quiet. It was not peace. Peace did not come that fast. It was more like the pause after a hard rain, when the streets were still wet and everyone was waiting to see what had been washed loose. Annie stayed near the breakfast room long after the plates were cleared. Clara kept offering to help Dolores, then stopping herself when Dolores raised an eyebrow. Honey, Dolores said at last, if you touch one more dish, I'm going to sit on your hands. Clara gave a tired smile. I don't know what to do with myself. Try sitting. I'm not good at that. I noticed. Annie smiled a little, and Clara looked relieved to have caused it. Richard watched from the doorway. He had spent the hour after breakfast on the phone with Paul Harris, then with the private investigator his company used for sensitive matters, then with a woman at the county archive office who became much more helpful when she realized who was calling. None of it made him feel better. Every answer pointed in the same direction. Clara's story was not clean, but it was real. Eleanor Grace arrived at 3 with a leather purse, her cane, and no patience for ceremony. Dolores opened the door for her, and Eleanor walked in as if the house had been waiting for common sense. Where is everybody? She asked. In the breakfast room, Dolores said. Good. I'm too old to wander rich people's hallways. Richard heard that from inside and stood as she entered. Eleanor gave him a brief nod, then went to Annie first. How are you holding up, sweetheart? Annie shrugged. I don't know. That's an honest answer. Clara stood. Mrs. Grace, thank you for coming. Eleanor looked her over. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't. Well, crying all night never did make anybody prettier. But sometimes it clears the pipes. She sat down with care and placed her purse on her knees. Now, Mr. Whitmore, you asked for the old story from someone who worked near the system, not inside your lawyer's version of it. Richard sat across from her. I asked for facts. Facts are fine, but don't confuse them with the whole truth. He nodded once. Go on. Eleanor opened her purse and removed a thin folder. I did not bring confidential files. I'm retired, not foolish. What I brought are copies of notes Clara gave me over the years, letters she sent, appointment cards, and my own written statement saying she tried to locate Annie after the adoption process moved beyond her reach. Clara looked down, embarrassed by the stack. I didn't know you kept those. You kept hurting yourself with the idea nobody would ever believe you, Eleanor said. So I kept paper. Annie leaned forward. She really came to you? Many times. Sometimes in the same work shoes, sometimes with bus transfers tucked in her sleeve because she didn't own a car. She was not always calm. She was not always saying things the way officials like to hear them said, but she came. Richard looked at Clara. Why didn't your name appear in the final file I received? Eleanor's mouth pulled tight. Because final files are made to comfort the receiving family. They give enough to move forward, not always enough to understand what was left behind. That sounds convenient. It is, for everyone except the woman crying in the waiting room. Annie's eyes filled, and Clara quickly said, Annie, don't carry that. I'm not carrying it, Annie whispered. I'm just hearing it. Richard noticed how Clara accepted correction from Annie the way a thirsty person accepts water. Not with pride. With care. Eleanor turned to Richard. You were not wrong to adopt her. Let me say that plainly. From what I can see, you gave Annie a stable home, education, safety, and a father's devotion. That matters. Richard's throat moved. Thank you. But Clara was not a monster in a file. She was poor. She was sick for a while. She lacked help. Those things become moral failures on paper faster than people admit. Clara pressed a tissue to her mouth. Annie looked at Richard. Dad, did your attorney say anything else? Richard hesitated. He said the early records support Clara's identity. The archive request may take longer, but he does not believe her documents are false. Annie breathed out, then looked at Clara. So she can stay? Richard's face tightened. Annie, I'm not asking to change everything today, but can she stay here? Not just tonight? Clara shook her head. No, baby, don't push him. I'm not pushing, I'm asking. Richard looked from Annie to Clara, then to Eleanor, who sat waiting with the quiet confidence of someone who knew silence could do more than advice. I will not have secrets in this house again, Richard said. If Clara stays, it will be openly. The staff will be told only what they need to know. No one will speak about this outside the property. Paul will arrange a counselor who understands adoption and family reunification. We will meet together at least once before any long-term decision. Annie nodded quickly. Okay. Clara looked overwhelmed. Mr. Whitmore, I can find a room somewhere. I don't want to stand in the middle of your life. Richard's answer came slower than usual. You are already in it. Clara lowered her eyes. He continued. The guest house is available for now. You will stay there as a guest, not as staff. You will receive back pay for the work you did, and severance from the cleaning contract. I don't want severance. You were mistreated by my employee in my house. I will not pretend that did not happen because accepting responsibility makes everyone uncomfortable. Dolores, standing near the doorway, gave one satisfied nod and tried to hide it. Annie's voice came small. Can I have dinner with her? Richard looked tired. Yes. Here? He paused. Here. With you too? That question took the air from him for a second. Annie was not trying to force closeness. She was afraid of separate dinners becoming separate loyalties. Yes, Richard said. With me too. Clara began to cry again, silently this time. Eleanor reached over and patted her arm. You're going to run out of water before supper, Clara May. Clara laughed through the tears, and Annie did too. Richard did not laugh, but the sound eased something in his face. Later, when Eleanor prepared to leave, Richard walked her to the front door himself. You understand, he said, that I am still angry. I'd worry if you weren't. I don't know how to do this. Eleanor looked at him over the top of her glasses. Most decent parents don't. They learn while trying not to break what they love. Richard opened the door for her. Before stepping out, she added, and Mr. Whitmore, don't make the mistake of thinking Clara is your enemy, because she knew Annie before you did. Time is not a competition, unless pride makes it one. After she left, Richard stood in the doorway a moment longer. In the breakfast room, Annie was helping Clara choose a mug for tea. Clara kept insisting any mug was fine. Annie kept saying this house had too many mugs for anyone to pretend that. Dolores fussed with the kettle, pretending not to listen. Richard watched them, then walked in. The blue one, he said. Annie looked up. What? Richard nodded toward the cabinet. She uses the blue one when she's nervous. Annie's face softened. Clara looked at him, surprised. Richard reached for his coffee and avoided both of their eyes. I told you. I remember everything about her. Clara took the blue mug with both hands, as though Richard had handed her more than porcelain. Dinner was harder than breakfast because dinner had time to become a decision. By 6, the kitchen smelled of roasted chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and sweet tea with lemon slices floating near the top of the pitcher. Dolores had made the food without asking anyone what they wanted. Comfort first, she said when Annie tried to help. Questions can wait until folks have eaten something real. Clara came in from the guest house wearing the same cardigan Dolores had given her, her hair brushed back, hands folded so tightly Annie wanted to pry them apart. She stopped near the kitchen entrance instead of walking to the table. Richard noticed. You can come in. Clara nodded. Thank you. Annie pulled out the chair beside her. Clara looked at Richard before sitting, and that small pause made Annie's eyes lower. Richard saw it too. He set his napkin beside his plate. You don't have to ask my permission for every breath, he said. Clara gave a faint smile. That may take longer than one dinner. Dolores, placing the cornbread down, muttered, at least she's honest. Annie almost laughed. Richard heard the sound begin and fade. He decided he wanted it back. Dolores has been saying things under her breath in this house for 9 years, he said. I've learned it's best to let her think I don't hear. Dolores did not turn around. That's because you're smarter than you look, Mr. Whitmore. Clara's eyes widened. Then she covered her mouth. Annie laughed. This time, quiet, but real. Richard did not smile much, but something eased at the table. They ate slowly. Clara took small portions until Annie added a spoonful of potatoes to her plate without asking. You need more than that. Clara looked at the plate. You sound just like you used to. Annie froze. I do? Clara's face softened. When you were little, you'd put food on my plate and say, Mama, you forgot you. Annie swallowed hard. Richard lowered his fork. That was the kind of memory he could not compete with. He could have bought every meal Annie had ever wanted after 6. But he could not buy his way into a kitchen before then, into a little voice reminding Clara to eat. Annie looked at him quickly. Dad. He shook his head once. It's all right. But it wasn't all right yet. They all knew that. After dinner, Annie carried the plates to the counter before Dolores could stop her. Clara rose to help, then sat down again when Richard looked at her. Annie noticed and said, Maybe we can all stop watching each other like we're about to break a rule. Richard leaned back in his chair. That may be the first practical suggestion of the evening. Clara folded her napkin. I don't want to make things harder for either of you. Annie turned from the counter. You keep saying that. Because it's true. No, Annie said softly. It's because you think you're the problem. Clara looked away. Richard spoke before Annie could say more. Clara, why did you not tell her after she found out? Clara's eyes came back to him. Because she has a life. A future. College. A father. I didn't want her carrying my guilt on top of her own questions. Annie returned to the table. I already had questions. I know that now. I used to think maybe my mother forgot me. Clara's hand went to her chest. Annie kept going, though her voice shook. Then I thought maybe she was gone. Then I got older and thought maybe she had a better life without me. I made up different answers because nobody gave me a real one. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Annie saw. Dad, I'm not blaming you. I should have asked more. You asked what you thought wouldn't hurt me. That is not always the same as helping. Clara looked at him then with something like respect. No, sir, it isn't. The room grew still, but not cold this time. Richard turned his glass in his hand. When Annie first came here, she kept that broken pinwheel under her pillow. If anyone moved it, she would know. I bought her new toys, dolls, paints, stuffed animals, things I thought would make a strange house feel less strange. She took them, thanked me, and put that broken thing back under her pillow every night. Clara's eyes filled. She still had it? Every night. Annie touched the edge of the table. I don't remember that. I do, Richard said. The first time she called me Dad, she was half asleep. She had a fever. I sat beside her bed with a thermometer and a bowl of ice water because I didn't know what else to do. She opened her eyes and said, Dad, don't turn the light off. Clara covered her mouth, crying silently. Richard looked at her. That was the happiest and most frightening moment of my life. Annie whispered, Why frightening? Because I knew then that if anything happened to you, there would be no version of me left that made sense. Clara looked down at her hands. That's what motherhood feels like, too. Richard did not correct her. He did not look away. Annie sat between them, feeling the shape of both loves at once. One had carried her into life and lost her to poverty and paperwork. One had received her later and guarded her with money, fear, and devotion. Neither story was simple. Maybe that was why both hurt. The doorbell rang. All three turned. Dolores came in from the hall with a frown. It's Mr. Harris. Richard stood. I asked him to come tomorrow. He says it can't wait. Richard's face changed. He went to the foyer and returned a few minutes later with Paul Harris, a thin man in his 60s with silver hair, a leather briefcase, and the tired caution of someone used to bad news arriving in polite envelopes. Paul greeted Annie gently, nodded to Clara, then addressed Richard. I apologize for coming during dinner, but the county archive responded faster than expected after your request. There is something you need to see. Annie's hand found Clara's under the table. Richard noticed. This time, he did not tell her to let go. Paul opened his briefcase and removed a copied document. The early file confirms Clara Mae Johnson made multiple attempts to regain contact after temporary placement. It also confirms those requests were marked, reviewed, but never forwarded once the adoption track began. Clara went very still. Richard's voice went quiet. Never forwarded to whom? To the reviewing office, and certainly not to you. Annie's face crumpled. So she tried. Paul looked at her with care. Yes, the record shows she tried. Clara closed her eyes. A sound left her, small and broken, as if some private sentence she had carried for 12 years had finally been answered by someone with a stamp and a file number. Richard took the paper. Who handled the transition? Paul hesitated. A county liaison and the private agency coordinator. Namis. I have them. Richard looked up. Get me everything. Annie's voice was thin. Dad, please don't turn this into a fight before we breathe. He looked at her, then at Clara. The old Richard would have moved at once, called 3 attorneys, demanded resignations, forced answers before midnight. But Annie was asking for breath, and Clara looked as if one more official word might split her open. Richard folded the document carefully. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight, we breathe. Paul seemed surprised, but nodded. After he left, no one returned to dinner. They stayed at the table with the food cooling and the truth warming between them in painful degrees. Clara finally whispered, "I thought maybe I hadn't tried hard enough." Annie leaned into her. "You did." Richard stood across from them, holding the document that proved a poor woman's love had been filed away and ignored. For the first time, he understood that Clara had not entered his house to steal a place from him. She had come because every proper door had been closed before she ever reached it. The next morning, Richard did not make phone calls before breakfast. That alone told Annie something had changed. He came downstairs in a plain white shirt instead of a suit, carrying the folded county document in one hand and Clara's old photograph in the other. Annie was already at the table, turning a spoon through oatmeal she had not eaten. Clara sat across from her with both hands around the blue mug Richard had chosen the day before. Dolores moved quietly near the stove, giving them the dignity of pretending not to listen. Richard placed the papers on the table but did not sit right away. "I owe both of you something," he said. Annie looked up. Clara set the mug down. Richard's voice stayed even, but it carried the strain of a man forcing himself not to hide behind authority. "Yesterday, I treated Clara as if her presence here could only mean harm. I listened to Harold because it was easier to believe a familiar voice than to question my own fear." Clara shook her head at once. "Mr. Whitmore, you were protecting Annie. I was protecting myself too." Annie's eyes moved between them. Richard looked at Clara. "You should not have had to stand in my foyer and be spoken to that way. Not by Harold. Not by me." Clara's fingers tightened around the napkin in her lap. "Thank you for saying that. It does not fix it." "No," she said softly. "But it matters." Richard finally sat. "Paul is arranging a meeting with the agency attorney this week. Not to reopen Annie's adoption. That is not what I'm doing." He looked at Annie, so she would hear the next part clearly. "You are my daughter. Nothing in those papers changes that." Annie's mouth trembled. "I know, but there were failures in the process. Clara's attempts should not have vanished in a file. If there are people still working that way, they need to be questioned." Clara lowered her eyes. "I don't want anyone losing their job because of me." Dolores turned from the stove. "Begging your pardon, Clara, but some folks need losing their job if they built it on ignoring mothers." The room went still, then Annie gave a small laugh through her nose. Clara looked embarrassed, but not offended. Richard said, "Dolores is not wrong." Dolores lifted the coffee pot. "Happens once in a while." Annie smiled, but it faded quickly. "What happens to us now?" That question was harder than any legal matter. Richard looked down at the table, then at Clara. "We go slowly. We tell the truth where it is needed. We do not make Annie carry adult decisions alone." Clara nodded. "Agreed." Annie looked almost relieved, then worried again. "Does that mean I can't see Clara without everybody planning it?" "It means we plan enough so no one feels pushed out or ambushed," Richard said. "You can see her. You can talk to her. I won't stop that." Annie's eyes filled. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Baby, breathe." Annie did, and the word baby no longer struck the table like a secret. It rested there, tender and painful, but aloud. After breakfast, Richard asked Clara to walk with him in the garden. Annie started to rise too, but he stopped her gently. "Give us 10 minutes." Annie looked unsure. Clara touched her shoulder. "I'll come right back." The garden path was still damp from recent rain. Richard walked beside Clara, not ahead of her, though she kept drifting half a step behind out of habit. After the third time, he stopped. "Clara." "Yes, sir?" "You don't have to walk behind me." She looked startled. "I wasn't thinking." "I know." They continued side by side. Richard watched a cardinal land on the low stone wall near the roses. Annie loved cardinals. When she was younger, she said they looked like red notes from heaven. He had not thought of that in years. "I need to ask you something difficult," he said. Clara folded her hands in front of her. "All right. If Annie had not said anything yesterday, would you ever have told her?" Clara took a long breath. "I don't know. That is not comforting. It's honest." He accepted that with a small nod. Clara looked toward the guest house. "Some mornings I told myself today would be the day. Then she'd walk by laughing about school or talking about college. And I'd think, who am I to bring old pain into that? Other mornings I thought I should leave before she noticed me too much. But you stayed." "Yes, Why? Clara's answer came quiet. Because leaving once nearly killed me. I didn't know how to do it twice. Richard looked away. For all the anger he had spent on Clara, he had not allowed himself to imagine that simple truth. Staying had been wrong in one way, but leaving had been impossible in another. I can't promise I won't feel threatened, he said. I know. I hate that. I know that too. He looked at her then. You say that as if you know me. I know fear when I see it. That struck him harder than he expected. Clara continued. You and I are not the same, Mr. Whitmore. You had power. I had none. You had lawyers. I had bus fare and office numbers that stopped working, but fear made both of us do things that hurt Annie. Richard stood still for a moment. Then he said, You're right. Clara did not look pleased. She looked sad that the truth had found them both. Inside the house, Annie watched from the breakfast room window with Eleanor, who had arrived while they were outside. They're talking, Annie said. That's better than fighting. Do you think Dad hates her? No. Do you think Clara hates him? No. Annie turned. How do you know? Eleanor settled into a chair with a soft groan. Because hate is loud even when it's quiet. What they have is fear, grief, and pride standing in the same room bumping elbows. Annie leaned against the window frame. I don't want to choose. Then don't. What if they make me? Then remind them love is not a courtroom. When Richard and Clara returned, Annie searched both faces. Clara gave her a small nod. Richard set the old photograph on the table in front of Annie. I'd like to frame this, he said. Annie looked up, surprised. Really? If Clara agrees. Clara stared at him. You want that picture in the house? Richard's answer was slow, but firm. It is part of Annie's life. This house should stop pretending her life began at 6. Annie covered her mouth. Clara turned away, wiping her eyes. Eleanor looked at Richard and gave one approving nod. Now that, she said, was almost more than wise. Richard sighed. Almost again? Don't get greedy. For the first time since the foyer, Richard almost smiled. Annie saw it and held on to that small change as if it were a promise. The photograph was placed in a simple wooden frame that afternoon. Richard did not send a staff member to do it. He drove himself to a small framing shop near Peachtree Road, the kind of place he had passed for years without noticing. Annie went with him. Clara stayed at the guest house, saying she did not want to intrude, though Annie knew that was not the whole reason. Clara was afraid of asking for too much too soon. In the shop, Annie stood beside Richard, while an older man behind the counter measured the faded picture with careful hands. Archival glass, Richard said. Nothing that will damage the paper. The man nodded. We can do that. Annie looked at her father. You don't have to make it fancy. I'm not making it fancy. I'm making sure it lasts. She lowered her eyes to the photograph. She kept it all this time in an envelope. She had fewer safe places than we did. Annie heard the change in his voice. Not guilt exactly, not pity, something more useful than both. On the drive home, they passed churches with letterboards, gas stations, oak trees, and school buses dropping students along quiet streets. Annie watched the city move outside her window and wondered how many mothers had ridden buses through Atlanta carrying papers nobody wanted to read. Richard kept both hands on the wheel. Dad? Yes? Are you still scared? He took a moment. Yes, she nodded. Me too. What scares you? That if I get too close to her, you'll feel left out. And if I worry about you, she'll think I'm ashamed of her. Annie pressed her thumb against the seatbelt. I feel like every feeling I have hurts somebody. Richard's face tightened. That should not be your burden, but it is. No, he said, quieter now. It has been placed near you. That is different. We can move it. Annie turned toward him. How? I don't know yet. She almost smiled. That's honest. I am learning from present company. When they returned, Clara was sitting on the small porch of the guest house with her hands folded around a cup of coffee gone cold. She stood as soon as Richard's car came up the drive. Annie got out first and went to her, holding the receipt from the frame shop. He's framing it, Annie said. The picture. Clara looked past her to Richard, unable to hide the emotion in her face. You didn't have to do that. Richard stepped closer. Annie should not have to keep pieces of herself in a box under the bed. Clara's lips trembled. No, she shouldn't. For a moment, the three of them stood in the yard with the late sun caught in the trees. No one knew what to do next. Then Annie laughed softly, more from nerves than joy. We're all very bad at standing together. Clara gave a small laugh too. Richard's mouth moved as if he might, but he held it back. Dinner at 6, he said. All of us. Clara nodded. I'll be there. And Clara? Yes, sir. Wear what you want, not the uniform. She looked down at herself, though she was not wearing the gray uniform anymore. I don't have much else. Dolores mentioned that. Clara's eyes widened. She did? She said if I could buy buildings, I could manage a decent dress without making it feel like charity. Annie covered her mouth to keep from laughing. Clara shook her head. That sounds like Dolores. It does, Richard said. She also said if I made you uncomfortable, she would deal with me. This time Clara laughed, and it was not broken. It was brief, but whole. That evening, Clara came to dinner in a navy dress Dolores had found from somewhere, simple and neat, with a cardigan over her shoulders. Annie told her she looked beautiful. Clara looked like she did not know where to put the compliment. Richard pulled out Clara's chair before she could do it herself. She stopped, startled. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. Annie noticed the effort in both of them and loved them for trying. Dinner was quieter than the day before, but less tense. Richard asked Clara about the diner where she had worked. Clara told him about morning regulars, truck drivers who wanted coffee before sunrise, church ladies who judged biscuits by touch, an old cook named Ray who used to say no one could be truly mean after good gravy unless they were committed to the work. Annie laughed. I want to go there. It closed years ago, Clara said. Then show me where it was. Clara hesitated. It's not like Buckhead. Annie's voice softened. I know. Richard looked at Clara. We can go this weekend. Clara looked at him as if he had spoken in another language. You would go? If Annie wants to know that part of her life. I should not be the man standing at the gate. Annie's fork stopped halfway to her plate. Clara looked down quickly, but not before Richard saw tears rise. After dinner, Annie asked if Clara would teach her the full lullaby. Clara's face changed at once. Tonight? Only if you can. Richard stood to leave them privacy, but Annie caught his sleeve. Can you stay? He looked at Clara, then Annie. Are you sure? Yes. So they sat in the family room, not the formal sitting room, but the room with worn blankets, old movie cases, and the sofa Annie used when she had the flu. Clara sat at one end, Annie beside her, Richard in the chair across from them. Clara sang softly at first. Her voice was not trained. It carried work, smoke from old kitchens, late buses, unpaid bills, and love that had survived. Being refused entry, Annie listened with her hands clasped under her chin. Richard listened too, and pieces of Annie's early years shifted inside him. The humming in the rain, the pinwheel under the pillow, the fear he could comfort, but not explain. When Clara finished, Annie wiped her eyes. Again? Clara looked at Richard, unsure. Richard nodded. Again. The second time, Annie hummed with her, quietly, uncertain at first, then stronger when memory found the melody. Richard did not join. It was not his song, but he stayed, and that became its own kind of promise. Later, after Clara walked back to the guest house and Annie went upstairs, Richard remained in the family room. The house was quiet around him. Dolores appeared at the doorway with a laundry basket. You look like a man who just discovered the house has more rooms than the blueprint said. Richard exhaled. You enjoy these little observations. At my age, entertainment is where you find it. He looked toward the window, where the guest house light was still on. I thought if I kept Annie safe enough, the past couldn't reach her. Dolores shifted the basket on her hip. The past always knows the address. Better to open the door while you're standing there with her. Richard said nothing for a while. Then he asked, Do you think she'll need me less? Dolores's face softened. No, sir. She'll need you different. That answer stayed with him after she left. Upstairs, Annie placed the broken bamboo pinwheel on her desk instead of hiding it away. Across the yard, Clara sat in the guest house and wrote one line in a notebook Eleanor had brought her. Today, my daughter asked me to sing, and no one made me stop. In his study, Richard opened his calendar and canceled 3 meetings for the next day. The assistant on the phone sounded surprised. "Family matter," Richard said. For once, he did not explain further. The next morning, Richard drove without a security detail. Annie noticed before they left the house. She stood near the front door in jeans, a soft sweater, and sneakers, holding the broken bamboo pinwheel wrapped in a scarf so it would not break further. Clara waited beside her in the navy dress again. Though she had changed into flat shoes Dolores insisted were better for walking. "No driver?" Annie asked. Richard picked up his keys from the hall table. "Not today." Clara looked uncertain. "Mr. Whitmore, I can take the bus and meet you there." Annie turned to her at once. "No." Clara's mouth closed. Richard opened the door. "We're going together." That word, together, made all three of them quiet for a moment. They drove south through Atlanta, leaving the wide roads and gated lawns of Buckhead for older streets with corner stores, brick churches, small houses with porches, tire shops, beauty salons, and murals painted on walls that had seen more summers than Richard's office tower had seen years. Annie sat in the back. Not because she wanted distance, but because she had asked Clara to sit up front. Clara refused twice, then accepted when Richard simply opened the passenger door and waited. Annie watched them from behind. Clara kept her purse on her lap with both hands. Richard kept his eyes on the road, but he drove slower than usual, as if he knew this part of the city deserved more than passing through. Clara pointed toward a corner lot with a faded sign above a boarded window. "That used to be Ray's diner." Annie leaned forward. "That's where you worked?" "Weekends. Sometimes nights if somebody called out." Clara gave a small laugh. "Ray made the worst coffee in Georgia and the best gravy in Fulton County." Richard parked along the curb. The building was closed now, weeds growing through cracks near the sidewalk. The old red awning had torn at one side. Annie stepped out and stood near the window, trying to imagine Clara younger, tired, carrying plates and counting tips, wondering whether there would be enough for rent. Clara stayed by the car. Annie turned. "Mama?" Clara's eyes closed briefly at the word. Then she walked over. "I used to bring you here early when daycare fell through," Clara said. "Ray would let you sit in the corner booth with crayons. You liked drawing the salt shakers." Annie smiled through sudden tears. "That sounds like me. You were quiet when you drew, loud about everything else." Richard stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets. "Did anyone help you?" Clara looked toward the old door. "Some did. Ray did. A church lady named Miss Pauline did when she could. But help is different when everybody helping is barely standing too." Richard nodded, taking that in without defending the world he came from. Annie placed the wrapped pinwheel against the window ledge. "Did I have birthdays here?" "One," Clara said. "Your fifth. Ray put a candle in a biscuit because the cake I bought got ruined on the bus." Annie laughed and cried at the same time. "A birthday biscuit? You liked it. You said cake was too soft anyway." Richard looked at Annie. "You still say that?" She turned to him. "I do. Every birthday. You eat the frosting and leave most of the cake." Clara smiled. She did that then too. For once, the shared fact did not cut Richard. It connected something. He and Clara stood on opposite sides of Annie's life, each holding a piece of the same habit. They walked 2 blocks to the apartment building where Clara had lived before Annie entered foster care. The building had been painted since then, but the stairs were the same. Clara stopped across the street. "I don't need to go closer." Annie slipped her hand into Clara's. "Okay." Richard looked up at the windows. "This is where you lost the lease?" Clara nodded. "The landlord wasn't a cruel man. He had bills too. That's what made it so hard. Nobody had to be evil for everything to fall apart." Richard turned to her. "That may be the most frightening thing you've said." It was the most frightening thing to live. Annie squeezed her hand. They ate lunch at a soul food restaurant Clara knew from years ago, still open under the daughter of the original owner. The place smelled of fried catfish, collard greens, cornbread, pepper vinegar, and sweet tea. People spoke across tables. A man near the counter argued about football. An older woman in a church hat told Richard he was blocking the napkins, and then thanked him when he moved. Annie loved it immediately. Richard looked out of place and knew it. Clara saw him fold his napkin with too much care and leaned toward him. "You don't have to act fancy in here. I wasn't aware I was. You were cutting cornbread with a knife." Annie burst out laughing. Richard looked down at his plate, then picked up the cornbread with his hand. "Better." Clara nodded. "Much." The lunch became easier after that. Clara told Annie about Miss Pauline, who used to braid Annie's hair when Clara's hands were too tired. Annie asked 100 questions, then apologized for asking too many. Clara told her there was no such thing today. Richard listened more than he spoke. Once, when Clara described sleeping sitting up because Annie had a fever and would cry if set down, he looked at her across the table. "I had a night like that," he said. Clara paused. "When?" "First year after the adoption. Flu. She wouldn't sleep unless I sat by the bed." Annie looked between them. "I don't remember any of this." "You weren't supposed to," Richard said. "You were sick." Clara added, "Love remembers for you when you can't." That sentence stayed with Annie for the rest of the meal. On the drive home, she fell quiet in the back seat. Richard glanced at her through the mirror. "You all right?" "I think so." She looked at the pinwheel in her lap. "It's a lot." Clara turned slightly. "Too much?" "No, just full." Richard understood that better than he expected. That evening, Annie asked to place the framed photograph in the family room, not in her bedroom. Clara objected at once. "Annie, that's your private memory. You don't have to put it where everyone can see." "I want it where we live," Annie said. Richard looked at the empty space on the shelf near Annie's graduation pictures, piano recital programs, and a framed newspaper clipping from her art award. He took the photograph from Annie and placed it there himself. Clara stood behind him with both hands over her mouth. The old picture looked small among the polished frames, but not weak. It changed the shelf by making it honest. Dolores came in carrying folded blankets and stopped when she saw it. "About time." Richard glanced at her. "You have a comment for everything, only when the Lord provides material." Annie laughed. Clara did too. Richard almost did. Later that night, Clara came to the back door with a small bundle of thin bamboo strips tied with string. Annie opened the door. "What's that?" Clara looked shy. "I thought maybe tomorrow I could show you how to make one." "The pinwheel? If you still want to learn." Annie stepped aside, then looked toward Richard, who was reading in the family room. "Dad?" He looked up. "Can she show me here?" Richard closed the book. He looked at Clara, then at the framed photograph on the shelf. "Yes," he said. "Here." Clara's shoulders eased. Annie took the bamboo strips as though receiving something fragile and important. "Tomorrow, then." Clara nodded. Tomorrow. After Clara crossed back to the guest house, Annie stood beside Richard in the family room, both of them facing the photograph. "She looks happy there," Annie said. "She does. Was I happy with you too?" Richard turned to her, startled by the question. "Annie, I know I was. I just need to hear it." He set the book down. "You were. Not every day. No one is. But yes. You laughed in this house. You grew here. You were loved here." She leaned into him, and he put an arm around her shoulders. Across the yard, the guest house light turned on. Annie watched it through the window, then looked back at the photograph. For the first time, the two parts of her life did not feel like they were fighting for space. They stood near each other, uneven and unfinished, waiting for morning. Morning arrived with a small pile of bamboo strips on the kitchen table. Clara came in through the back door just after breakfast, carrying a spool of thread, a pocket knife, and a paper bag from the hardware store. She paused when she saw Richard already seated at the table with Annie. "I can come back later," Clara said. Annie shook her head. "No, please don't." Richard looked at the tools in Clara's hand. "Do we need anything else?" Clara seemed unsure how to answer. "A little patience." Annie gave a tired smile. "We have some of that now." "Some," Richard said. Clara laughed softly, and the sound made the morning easier. They sat together at the kitchen table. Clara showed Annie how to wet the bamboo so it would bend without splitting, how to shave the edges thin, how to cross the pieces without forcing them. Annie watched closely, her hands careful, but still nervous. "What if I break it?" she asked. "Then we start again," Clara said. Richard, who had been watching from across the table, said, "That may be the lesson hiding in the craft." Annie glanced at him. "Dad, did you just make a metaphor before 9 in the morning?" "I regret it already." This time all three of them laughed. The first pinwheel came out crooked. Annie held it up, embarrassed. It looks awful. Clara tilted her head. It looks like it survived. Richard stood, took it from Annie, and carried it to the open back door. A light breeze moved through the kitchen. The little bamboo blades trembled, then turned once, unevenly but clearly. Annie covered her mouth. Clara whispered, "There it goes." Richard handed it back to Annie. "Not awful." Annie held it with both hands. "Can we make another one?" Clara looked at Richard without meaning to. He noticed. "You don't need permission to teach her," he said. Clara's eyes softened. "I'm learning that." The weeks that followed did not become simple. There were counseling appointments in an office with soft chairs and a woman who asked hard questions kindly. There were evenings when Annie wanted Clara close, then needed time alone. There were moments when Richard heard Annie say "Mama" and had to leave the room for a minute, not because he was angry, but because the words still found tender places in him. There were also mornings when Clara sat at the breakfast table without needing to be invited, and Richard poured coffee into the blue mug before she asked. Paul Harris confirmed the county archive in full. Clara had tried. Her letters had been received, reviewed, delayed, then buried under the clean machinery of final paperwork. Richard did not make a public war of it, not because he lacked power, but because Annie asked him to begin with repair before punishment. Still, he funded a legal aid project for birth families navigating the foster and adoption system, and he named Eleanor Grace to the advisory board before she could refuse. "You can't appoint an old woman without asking," Eleanor told him. "I was told old women enjoy giving advice." "We enjoy giving advice, not attending meetings." "Paid meetings," Richard said. Eleanor paused. "Well, the Lord does provide." By the time Annie's graduation arrived, the house had learned a new rhythm. The framed photograph of Clara and Annie at 5 sat in the family room beside Annie's recital pictures and art awards. The old broken pinwheel remained on Annie's desk. The new crooked one stood in a small vase near the window, turning whenever the air conditioner came on too strong. On graduation morning, Annie came downstairs in her cap and gown, holding both hands in front of her because they would not stop shaking. Richard was waiting in the foyer. Clara stood beside a soft green dress Dolores had helped choose. For a second, Annie stopped at the bottom step, caught by the sight of them together. Not perfect, not effortless, but there. Richard walked to her first. He adjusted the edge of her graduation stole with the same focus he used to bring to business contracts. "You look ready," he said. "I don't feel ready." "That has never stopped you." Clara stepped forward next, but slowly. Annie looked at her, eyes already wet. "Mama, can you fix?" Clara's hands rose to the cap, then trembled. Richard saw and said, "It is crooked." Annie laughed through tears. "That's not comforting. I wasn't asked to comfort. I was asked for accuracy." Clara adjusted the cap gently. "There. Now it's right." At the school, families filled the auditorium with flowers, programs, cameras, and the low hum of proud voices. Richard sat on one side of Annie's reserved row. Clara sat on the other. At first, there was a space between them, left by habit rather than intention. Eleanor arrived late, looked at the gap, and lowered herself right into it. "Well," she said, "if nobody knows where to sit, I do." Annie saw them from near the stage and smiled for the first time that morning without fear. When her name was called, Richard stood first. Clara rose half a second later. Then Dolores, Eleanor, and half the row around them stood too. Annie crossed the stage with tears in her eyes and a smile she could not hide. She accepted her diploma, then looked down at the people who had come for her. Later, because she had been chosen to speak for her class, Annie stepped to the microphone. Her hands shook against the paper, but she did not fold it away. "I used to think family was a story with one beginning," she said. "This year, I learned some stories begin twice. Some love raises you, some love searches for you, and if you are blessed, life gives you enough courage to receive both." Richard lowered his head. Clara pressed a tissue to her lips. Eleanor whispered, "That girl can talk." After the ceremony, families gathered on the lawn. Richard handed Annie a bouquet of white roses. Clara stood slightly behind, as she still did sometimes when emotion made her unsure. Annie noticed at once. "No more standing outside the picture," Annie said. Clara blinked. Annie took her hand and pulled her beside Richard. A teacher offered to take the photo. Richard stood on Annie's right, Clara on her left. Annie held the crooked bamboo pinwheel in front of her diploma. "Ready?" the teacher asked. Annie looked at Richard, then Clara. "I am now." That night, they did not host a grand party. Annie asked for dinner at home: fried chicken, collard greens, mashed potatoes, cornbread, peach cobbler, and sweet tea. Richard cut the cornbread with his hand this time, which made Clara smile into her napkin. After dinner, Clara gave Annie one last gift. It was a new bamboo pinwheel, better made than the first, with a small line carved into the handle. For the girl who came home twice, Annie held it to her chest. "You made this?" With steadier hands this time. Richard looked at Clara's wrist, at the old scar that had started as pain and become proof. Annie walked to the open window. The Atlanta night moved softly through the room. The pinwheel turned, slow and sure. Richard stood behind her, and Clara stood beside him. No one reached too quickly. No one spoke just to fill the silence. Annie looked at both of them and whispered, "I don't feel split anymore." Richard touched her shoulder. Clara took her hand, and in that quiet room, beneath the soft turning of a handmade bamboo pinwheel, Annie Whitmore finally understood that love had not divided her life in two. It had brought every broken piece of her home. The lesson of this story is that love is not a competition, and family is not always simple. Sometimes the person who raises you saves your future, while the person who lost you never stopped loving you in silence. Clara's pain, Richard's fear, and Annie's courage remind us that truth may hurt at first, but hiding it hurts longer. Real justice begins when we stop judging people by their job, their poverty, or their past, and start listening to the love they carried when no one was watching. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.